Okay, well, since it's 2 o'clock, we'll go ahead and get started. I know, Ben, you have a lot of content to cover, so I'll just say, just briefly, hello, everyone. Congratulations, you've made it to class 8 of 8. We have reached the end. And we are here joined by our Department of Medicine colleague, Ben Priestley. He is the Associate Director and Division Manager of the Center for Health Policy and the Center for Primary Care and Outcomes Research. We affectionately call that PCOR here in the Department of Medicine. He provides leadership and oversight for the financial operations, strategic planning, human resources, grant and contract administration, near and dear to our hearts, academic affairs, and facilities and space planning. He also, which is what brings him here with us today, he has expertise in interventional clinical research operations and management, specifically in cancer trials. So we have invited him here to talk with us about clinical trials from the 20,000-foot view, right, Ben? And
right.
Maybe walk us through some afterwards. So instead of doing the breakout sessions as we've done in some of the other classes, we're going to leave time at the end for the group to just ask questions, and then we can all hear and learn from those questions. So with that, Ben, I'll hand it over to you if you want to go ahead and share your screen, and thank you for joining us.
Yes, terrific. All right. All right, so let me get my screen up here. All right, is that coming through? Maybe not.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, you can see the slide deck? Okay, great.
Yes.
All right, terrific. Okay, hi everybody. So I am just getting my screen set up so I can see all of you guys as we do this. I have sort of many screens to look at here, so you'll have to bear with me. I have a lot of things to show you, and I'll be trying this format so that I can flip between different windows as we look at some websites and so forth. So as Emily described, I'm going to be talking about the topic of clinical trial administration. We're going to be zooming way, way out to the very kind of high level, we call it the 10,000-foot view, just to give you a sense of all the different components as you guys are administering research projects, clinical trials with your divisions or departments, all the different components that go into these things. You might hear from talking with faculty, gosh, it takes so long to get a trial open here, and not really understanding why that is. And hopefully after this presentation, you'll have a little bit of a sense of, yeah, there are a lot of moving parts that go into a trial. And maybe, you might look into how to make things a little bit more efficient for your unit to try to get through that process a little bit more smoothly with your faculty. The intent here is to have this be as interactive as possible. Although it is a slide presentation, I'll be going through and talking. If you have questions, I want to invite you to drop a question into the chat if that works better for you. Or you can also just interject. I'll pause from time to time and ask if there are questions, and I definitely encourage you to jump in there. To start off, I wanted to ask if maybe you guys through chat, or if someone wants to say something out loud, that's fine. What's one thing you want to get out of this presentation of learning about clinical trials? Or what's one question you might have had about clinical trials? Maybe I could try to touch on it as we go through. So one example is you might say, how do I close out a trial? Or my PI wants to open a trial, but we have no money, or I don't know, something that's on your mind. If you don't have a question, that's okay too. But I'm looking for 3 among this group, 3 questions. All right, so I don't see any, I don't know if I actually have the chat up. Let me pull up the chat. I'm gonna wait to see if any questions come in. Anything? All right. Emily, thank you, Emily. Should we use a clinical trials study tracker or put everything in CRISP? Ingrid's looking for all of the above that I might have mentioned there. Gavin, what is cradle to grave process for clinical trial management at Stanford? We'll definitely be covering that. Clarita says how to set up the trial correctly from the beginning, how to manage invoices. Great. Amy, what do you find the top 3 most challenging issues with clinical trials? Great. And how to manage, Ben says how to manage post-award for clinical trials. Terrific. Okay, we'll try to cover as much of that as possible, and then we'll review and see if there's anything we missed. All right, so on to our next slide. Just kind of general housekeeping. It's going to be about an hour of content. I'm going to try to just not talk for an hour, but I'll try to break it up with a chance for questions. And if you have questions as we go, please drop them in comments. And if I don't get it right away, I'll try to come back to it and address it. Okay, so lifespan of a clinical trial. This is where we're going to start. I've kind of grouped things into 3 buckets. We have setup, we have you got to operationalize it, and you got to close it. So the first thing I can say about this is however long you think it's going to take for one of these components, especially the setup, I would say triple that in your mind, factor of 3, that's probably what you're going to be looking at. And we'll talk a little bit about why, and there are ways for groups to get more efficient with some of these steps so that you can turn things over a little bit more quickly with your teams. So first up, clinical trial setup. All right, so I'm going to propose here for setting up a trial that we have 3 buckets of things, or not 3, sorry, these buckets of things to think about. We have contract development, budget development, regulatory components, feasibility review, and site initiation, visit, and launch. Okay, so if we get all of these in place, we'll be ready to go. Does anyone think I missed any step there? Hopefully not. So, all right, we're gonna say let's look at these 5. So, first is contract development. When you want to get a clinical trial up and running, you're going to need a document that is an agreement between the sponsor's trial, the trial sponsor and Stanford. So this is where lawyers are going to be involved. And for Stanford, for our team, we're going to use a team called the Research Management Group. And within RMG, the Research Management Group, there's a unit that focuses on clinical trials. So they have a website which has a lot of great resources for you as an administrator as you want to look at what goes into clinical trials and all the contractual elements therein. So this is the website here, this link here. And so you guys will either have, I think at the end of this, Emily's going to send out the slide deck PDF. So you have that URL in there in the slide deck. But this is that page. And it gives you definitions. What is a clinical trial? How do I set up a clinical trial? All of these sort of checklists and resources are going to be found on this page. Definitely one to bookmark as you're learning clinical trials and you're getting to know what it is you need to do. So I'm not going to go into each one of these things, but we're going to just look at a very high level. How do you point yourself in the right direction to get to learn about some of these aspects of setting up a trial? So what you're going to need to put in place is an agreement with the sponsor. And for some of our sponsors, they will have already had an agreement with Stanford. So to ask you guys, what's an example of a sponsor of a clinical trial? Like what company might we be working with? Does anyone have any examples? All right, good. Ingrid, Gilead, Ashley, NIH, perfect. Clarita says Corpus. I'm not familiar with that one, but that sounds like, yes, that could be a sponsor of a trial. So these are groups that have money often and wants to have a trial done, and we are going to be the ones to do it. And if we've worked with some of these big players before, chances are that we have a master agreement with that unit. Okay, so that means that their lawyers and our lawyers have gone together and they've put the framework, they put the umbrella in place for how we're going to work on things together, right? But this particular trial that your doctor wants to work on is going to be new. It's going to have a different set of elements. It's going to be a different scope of work. And so the way that we kind of get through the contracting a little bit more speedily is that we have a master umbrella agreement for many of these groups. And then we will put together a specific scope of work agreement that matches your trial. Okay, so the terms are a little bit easier to work through in that case. If you have, let's say, a brand new pharmaceutical group you're going to be working with, a biopharma, there might not be a master agreement in place. In which case, as you're working with your contact at CTRMG, they might look through their library to see if they have a master agreement, come back and say, no, we need to negotiate that here in this place, in this case, and get you started. And that's fine. It might take a little bit longer, but they're generally pretty quick about what they do. Okay, and then when it comes to like, actually, how do I get started here? Generally speaking, when you have a sponsor you're working with, especially in the corporate world, they're going to have a template of a contract, some template language that they're going to give you. It's going to be in like a startup packet, and that's what you're going to need when you loop in the CTRMG group. Okay, and so in the study setup, they're going to be asking you for your template agreement. Okay, and when you think about, well, what is my template agreement? You should probably be checking with the sponsor about that. Okay, and then a subcomponent of that is budget development. So the contract is going to be a lot of the language around enrollment and data sharing and on and on and on. But there's often going to be a language in there about how is pay going to flow between the two parties. And there may actually also be an attachment, which is a budget. So Appendix A or Exhibit A, and then sort of the details of how much per patient will be funded by the sponsor, how much will be given for IRB costs, and on. So how do you get started with that? Generally, the sponsor is going to have a framework of what they think this should cost, and so you're going to ask them for their template. Also, generally, they're going to want to see the budget broken down in the template format that they wish. So that may be reasonable. Sometimes it's not, but you want to start from there. Say, hey, do you have a sponsor template? Do you have a budget template, and could I get that from you? It seems obvious, but like I've had study contacts that they'll say, hey, talk to your doctor. We want to get this going yesterday. Here's the mock, or here's your consent form. That's what they're going to send you. They're going to say, here's the consent form. When can we get started? And you're gonna be like, do you have a contracts template? Oh yeah, no, our legal team's still working on it. But you'd be like, well, okay, like we can't really get a trial going if you guys aren't even ready to sign a contract, right? It's pretty wild. Or you'd be like, oh, do you guys have a budget, template for us? Oh, we're still working on that. And so, but they want you to put the consent form through your IRB. It's like, okay, time out. Before we really get started with this stuff, we need to have all of this together. We need to have your consent form. That's great. We're going to need to have your scope of work contract language. We're going to need to have your template budget. And really, it's not time efficient for our team to do any work on this until we have your package together. And that's usually enough to get them moving pretty quickly to get those back to you guys. This is a little bit of the flow that can be how to make things most efficient. So you're not strung along for a long time with different parts of the setup going together. Okay. Questions so far? All right. There's this point, coverage analysis. So this is a bit of a complicated point, and I'm just going to touch on it. And then, this is something to be explored kind of in further discussion as needed. But when you have a clinical trial, the clinical trial it should be paying for anything that is considered unique to that study that's above and beyond the standard of care for a patient. So let's say I have a study that's has patients come in and let's say they have colon cancer and they are going to get a pill. We're going to give them a pill that is our study medication. At the same time, they're going to be getting some chemotherapy that same day. Okay, just setting up the stage of this scenario. Okay, so then when we're doing our study budget, we're going to say, okay, that patient comes in, they see their doctor, they're getting their chemotherapy that day. Does the study pay for the chemotherapy? Well, the chemotherapy is standard of care. That's actually something the patient would be getting anyway, right? This is what they normally would go through for their care. Yes, it's treating their cancer. Yes, it's being given by our hospital and our study team is involved, but that's something that insurance will be picking up because that is something that is approved care for that patient. Also, the labs they're getting on that day, let's say they're having their blood counts checked and their blood chemistries checked to see if that's safe. Generally, that might be standard of care too, because that's something that doctors would do when someone's coming in, irrespective of the trial. The pill is something, the cost of that pill should be covered by the study, right? Because they wouldn't otherwise be getting that pill. You might need those labs to check to see if they're healthy enough on that day to take that pill. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the study is going to be paying for that lab. But how do you really know that? And the answer to that question is coverage analysis. So going into the study, a team needs to look at the study plan and compare that against what is standard of care for this patient population, and then make a determination of what does Medicare cover and what does Medicare not cover. And Medicare is considered the gold standard for what insurance ought to cover, okay? So this used to be a really tough process for a study team because the way that coverage, the way that Medicare coverage was analyzed on a clinical trial design was that we would hand the protocol to the doctor, the PI, and say, please tell us, based on your expertise as a clinician, please parse this out. Stanford has actually moved away from that now, and we actually utilize the team to do that analysis for us. And so that is detailed on this same page that I was highlighting under clinical trials. You'll see a coverage analysis FAQ and a coverage analysis memo, as well as a process and training link. We're not going to go into each one of those things, but I will just highlight the memo, and it just describes that there's a vendor that we're using called Incura, which will be completing that analysis for us. And so we'll be submitting documents to them, and then they will be returning back to us the plan as the budget is created of what the study should be covering and what will be considered standard of care. Questions about that? Anyone? Has anyone ever had to do one of these or been involved with that before? No? All right. So it's important to know as you're looking at, what is the study reimbursing? How do they come up with that? Like, who really decided what is study costs and what are not study costs? And now you kind of will have a sense for there was an analysis done to help determine that. Okay. All right. And so then we get to the point of kind of all those soft components, like this is really important, is like time, my effort as a coordinator, my doctor's effort on this study. And this is something that's going to require negotiations. The sponsor is undoubtedly going to offer something that's a third of what it really costs time-wise. And then there's going to be a need to come back and say, well, actually, this is what our costs will look like for clinical research time, a coordinator time, data analysis or data entry time, the physician's time. And it really will require someone on your unit to stand their ground to a degree when you're working with a sponsor. The people that you're negotiating with, certainly from if you're working in cancer trials and you have someone helping you with a budget creation, you have someone helping you put together what is the cost for this and that, but not necessarily negotiating for you, right? Insisting that you guys are looking out for what your unit needs to cover your time. And that is so important so that you have the budget to do good work and not drive yourself into a hole financially. All of this is incredibly frustrating to deal with if it's done poorly and you have a trial that's years down the road. The time to get it right is that negotiation and setup. And that will set you up for success for years down the road, okay? So the key takeaway there is when you think about who's really negotiating these prices, think about that's actually the administrative team here, right? And really having a good conversation with your physician about how to best support everyone for success, including standing up for the costs and coverage that you guys need to run a good trial. Okay. The counter pressure is that they're going to want to get that trial open yesterday, and they're going to see this negotiation process as one of the barriers to them actually getting this trial going and getting the treatment possibly for their patients. So the PIs might be motivated to kind of skim this and not really negotiate a good contract, but just know that your sponsors are come to Stanford for a reason. They really want to work with your PIs, and that's our leverage. Okay. All right. Just by a quick show of hands, does anyone have a role where they believe they'll be working on trial budget and setup? Yeah. Good. Okay. Yeah. So there's a few of you out there. That's good. Okay. So then when you have a trial setup, you also have to think about regulatory components. So clinical trials are heavily regulated for good reason. And so we have a whole collection of groups that need to give endorsement for a trial to be launched at Stanford. And so this is a list of those groups. So we have a database which records the existence of the trials that we are running. It's a platform called Encore, made by a company called gosh, it's not Ensemble, but it, I'm blanking on the team that makes this. But we have to have all of our trials registered within Encore. So there's a little bit of like, hey, I have a study with this doctor going through a registration process with the Encore team. We have our institutional review board, also known as our IRB. So we need to have the IRB review what our work's going to be, which is known as a protocol, and they need to give us approval before we can do the trial. There's a scientific review committee that often will be needed, especially if you have oncology or hematology trials. They're trying to make sure that Stanford's general resources are being used in a good way, that we're not being wasteful by opening, say, thousands of trials that have no chance of enrolling anybody. We want to be doing the most critical work, the most impactful work. And so as we are reviewed as an institution for some of these designations, like being a designated comprehensive clinical cancer center, the groups that review our institution for designation are going to expect to see a robust committee in place that makes sure that resources are being used well. So our institution requires certain types of studies to go to the SRC for approval. We have, for certain types of studies, there might be something where it's the biosafety of that compound needs to get a little bit more review. So an example of that, I once worked on a study that took, gosh, what was it? It was a bad virus. I think maybe it was polio, and they basically like attenuated it so that it was no longer going to infect someone, and they combined it with a molecule that was making this then become a treatment. So the body would sort of identify this virus, say, oh, this is bad. Oh, and I recognize this other kind of molecule here. And so then that would help the body's immune system to fight the cancer that they had. If you're going to be administering people with this virus that was sort of the real virus, but just sort of deactivated in certain ways, for that type of research, the IRB would indicate you need to have the administrative panel on biosafety also look at that and make sure that that is going to be safe for everybody. That's embedded into the IRB process. And then we have clinicaltrials.gov. This is a very important registration component where we are telling the government about our clinical trials that we have open. Grace, did you want to say anything about that one in particular? Sorry to put you on the spot, but I know you put the link in there, which I appreciate. I know that there's sort of a need for us to make sure that everything is up to date in that, but I just wanted to ask, do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I just help you to copy the link to the chat box.
Perfect. I appreciate that. No problem.
No.
Generally, what they're going to be looking for on that one, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, is they're going to be looking for primary endpoint and sort of overall endpoint of your trial. All right. Okay, so 2 more components on setup. We have feasibility review. Is there a team to do the study? Is there space to do the study? Can the hospital execute the study? Does the budget add up for us to make this happen? So there's just so much that goes into this where, I mean, you get studies kind of, the train leaves the station, you're about to do the study and you realize, oh, like we haven't checked with the nursing team that's going to be working with us on this study. And they're going to look at this and go, no, we can't do this. This is crazy. So I'll give you an example of feasibility issue. So we had a study that the intention here was to, they had a compound that they was given by an IV infusion, and they thought that it would actually, the study team, the company that created this drug thought it would be better if some blood was taken from the patient, like you were giving blood, donating blood or something. So like if some blood was taken into like an IV bag, and then the pharmacist mixed the drug with the patient's blood, sort of in that IV bag, and then that blood was then re-administered to the patient, sort of like a new infusion, and that would somehow kind of alleviate some issues that were being side effects that were happening with the drug. So as the doctor and the coordinator are reading this, they're going, okay, great, sounds good, and they got it all approved from the IRB and whatnot. And then they go to do it, and it's like the nursing team is like reading this, going, heck no, like we cannot do this, right? Like we are not set up for this. The pharmacist was like, no, we are not going to be handling blood in our pharmacy, like, and we mix the drugs and then they leave our pharmacy, like we're not doing like sort of this lab stuff here. Feasibility, kind of total point of like really thinking through this protocol and saying, can we do this? What are the hiccups? Who do we need to get endorsement from through the hospital to actually execute this trial? Okay. And then once you have all of that in place, you can actually you get your study kind of put together and launched. So there's some forms that are accepted through Stanford. There's a proposal development routing form called the PDRF. There's attachments within our electronic research administration portal called SARA. You would have a notice of award and then a award approval notification. Documents telling you that your study is approved, and then your study team is going to do a kickoff event to let everyone know we're ready to enroll. Here are our eligibility criteria, ready and go. Okay, so coming back to that, as you think about all the things that go into launching a trial, and they say, okay, I have a study, here's my consent form, when can we start consenting our patients? There's a reason why it takes so long. And one thing that can help your team contract that timeline is to think about, how to organize your work. Maybe have an intake form that is helpful for your coordinators or PIs to have, so that as they have a study, you can hand them this form and say, here are all the things that my team needs to be successful, and it's going to have on there consent form, contract, budget, study protocol, etc. Okay. And I don't have it up actually here, but we have some example intake forms. Let's see if I can actually pull one up. I have my folder here, but I have like, let's see. Yeah, here we go. So this is an example of an intake checklist. So if we're going to have someone who says they want to do a trial, we have a document where we're going to ask them to give us all of these components. from the get-go. And if they don't have that, you know, we may not be ready to go. And I just pulled one up. This might not actually be the perfect form, but it gives you an idea of what I mean. So, okay. All right. Okay. So we're going to talk we're going to move into some of the operationalizing of the trial. We're going to talk about patient sort of like the dollars that come in and how to that sort of post-award aspect of clinical research. So that's kind of this next section. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. So operationalizing it. And you thought study startup was hard. Just wait till you get to this stuff. All right, so you're going to have a signed contract and budget. You're going to need to know about CRISP. You're going to have patient reimbursements to consider, possibly, depending on your contract. You're going to have, through the life of the trial, you're going to have contract and budget amendments that are going to come up. You're going to have times where you're going to need to reconcile the money that's been received with what we expect to have received. And you're going to have to keep up things in systems like clinicaltrials.gov in terms of primary endpoints and final endpoints. Okay, so reading a contract and budget. So part of this class that I have here is I'm going to take you guys through an exercise of how to read a budget for a clinical trial. So let's do that. Okay, so when you have a contract, you are often going to have an attachment to your agreement, and it's going to be probably a PDF document, but it's going to be a printout of an Excel file, and it's going to look something like this. I know it's very small. I'll zoom in again, but you guys, I just want to get a scope of this, right? All of this stuff here is your budget. And you're going to have different tabs, which might be different pages of your contract. That's going to have a per patient fee. So this is called an other fee section. Okay. All right. So I'm going to zoom in on a couple things here. Okay. Let me make this a little bigger so it's viewable. Okay. So this is a mock version. So don't worry, I'm not showing any sort of real life thing. You're going to have at the top, you're going to have some header information. You're going to have, a number that we refer to internally to refer a unique number to this trial. It's called a SPO number. You're going to have an agreement date. Typically, it's going to say, when was this agreement in effect? That's very important as you start getting contract amendments that go forward, because as you have an amendment, you might have a price change. What you did charge X for is going to now be charged Y. And you're going to do that as of a particular date, right? And that's part of the homework that I'm going to be sending along with this class. I think you guys in the other classes have been getting homework assignments, yeah? So so this one has one as well. And it's really key to key in on is what date does this contract kind of exist? And then as you have an amendment, so in this case, this file has an amendment. And it won't be set up like this when you receive it. You'll just have like your contract language, and then you'll have an attachment with the new budget. But this would be the new budget, let's say. And so that has a future date, right? So you want to key in on what is the date this becomes live. And then you're going to have all of these elements that are covered maybe or maybe not by your trial budget. Okay, so this is literally your budget. So you're going to have along this row here, these are time points for the patient as they go through the trial. So, and there's all these codes here. And what does PC stand for? What does INV stand for? So some of those will be on the bottom. There'll be notes. PC stands for personnel costs. And it's rolled up into this personnel fee section, which should be basically here. It's the combination of these three things. These are personnel costs. So when I'm looking at screening and all of the costs associated with screening, I'm not going to put for informed consent maybe like $100. What I'm going to say is that is reflected in the costs that I put in for my PI and my coordinator and maybe my data manager. Okay. So anything with the PC here is we put a time basically your budget, you'd have an estimate of how many hours, PI time, how many hours coordinator time it takes, and then that would get you a dollar amount. SOC is standard of care, so we're not charging for that. C1, W1, D1, cycle 1, week 1, day 1. So when the patient comes in for their first dose, cycle 1, week 1, day 1, this is all the stuff that we expect to have happen. So as an example, a urinalysis would be conducted. It would be $26.09 would be the cost. Coagulation studies would be done. They would cost $199.65. All of these costs are rolled up into, including the personnel, including if there's a cost for some research units will charge you, like there's a unit called the Clinical Trials Research Unit, CTRU. If you're doing your study there, they would have given you a cost estimate of what their work will cost. Anyway, it all comes down into a total visit fee, okay? So as your patient has cycle 1, week 1, day 1, that they're going to be charged, we're going to charge the sponsor. The sponsor will be paying you $9,203.41. And that covers all of this above it, all of these pieces above, okay? Okay, so the homework assignment, just to give you a little preview of it, is going to look like this. So it's going to say trial budget. How do I read it? For each item, just determine what the billable cost will be to the sponsor. Reference the attached exhibits, which we were just looking at, which include 2 different budget versions. And for each item, write the budget version used, the fee description, and the cost. Okay, so as an example, we'll do first patient completes cycle 1, week 2, day 8 on February 20th, 2018. Okay, so what I would say is, all right, let's see if I can get these to show up on the same time. Okay, so so I have a patient that was enrolled on, let's say, and is having the cycle done on February 20th, 2018. So this version of the budget, Amendment 1, takes effect June 17, 2019. So this is too new. I need to be looking at the original budget, okay? Because this is before that date. So if I go back to my original budget, and these documents and these budgets will likely be attached in SARA. So if you are new to a study, you would go into SARA, you would look at the attachments within, and you would be able to find the signed agreement, and hopefully in there also the signed or the external budget that was approved, which would be this document that we're looking at. Okay, so we have, we need cycle 1, week 2, day 8, here it is. And what we're going to do is we're going to scroll down to the rolled up price point, total visit fee with overhead for cycle 1, week 2, day 8, $3,069.88. And what I would do is I would put that in right here. Okay. And you would describe it very similarly to the way that the budget describes it. So, something like cycle 1, week 2, day 8, patient visit. Okay, that's what the sponsor is going to expect when they think about how is this described. That's what your invoice should reflect when it goes out. And you can't really say, oh, no, sorry, we decided, we changed our mind. We think our coordinators are spending more time on this project. We're going to double the, this component. Can't do it. This is the agreed upon price, right? If you want to amend your budget, that's a different conversation, and that can be done, but that goes back through the legal team, right? They need to expect what they get on their invoices need to exactly match to the penny what's in your budget. Okay. In this case, this is the original budget, not the amended budget. Okay. Okay, so that's an example, and you can see this 5th patient has the same visit but on a later date. So I would go to this this new version takes effect on that date. My computer is being a little slow with all the windows I have open, but you'll see here, column F, it's a slightly different price. Nancy, I'll come back to your question in a second. So this one, 3197.88. That's this price here. Okay, so you can see the same visit because I had on my amendments, we changed one of the components of the prices. This is what we bill the sponsor. Nancy, your question was, how do you match to the penny when the sponsor often rolls several invoices together and doesn't identify which invoices they are paying? So it's a good question. So that is not something that I've seen. So we haven't gotten into like how the mechanism of payment comes in, but you're speaking to a good point, which is that for these kinds of study payments, let me come back to my slide deck here. This the concept of milestones. Okay, so in your agreement with the sponsor, what's very common is that for these visits that have so many different components into it, you guys may have agreed in the concept of the document, the legal language, that when the data for that visit was entered and verified by the company, they would automatically trigger a payment that was agreed to in the contract. Okay, that'd be called a milestone. So we could say we have a cycle one, day one, cycle one, week one milestone, and it pays $3,000. And when the data, the lab values, the dose of treatment, all the data that goes onto a data form that they're going to expect is entered. It's often online these days. And they send one of the representatives out to verify that medical data. They'll often compare it against medical records, make sure that data is valid. It matches the documentation that we have on site. And then that has received a check mark from their clinical trial sponsor, clinical research organization, CRO. They would then internally say, cut Stanford a check, right? And they might do this in a batch format. So to Nancy's question, how do you, when you have a bunch of milestones that have all been batched together, how do you parse it out and say, what did they pay for here? So Nancy, in my experience, the invoice detail should tell you which visits they're paying for. So they should say, we're paying you for patient one for cycle one, day one, visit one, or whatever. So there should always be a detail that goes with that check. If there's not, that's a chance to actually go back to the sponsor and request, hey, we received a check from you on this date. Here's the check number. Could you please provide us the detail that goes with that check? So yeah, that might be a case where the detail was not sent or something, but there will be details somewhere in their systems about what they're paying for. And so you can get to that. Yeah. Okay, like I said, this is kind of high level is the intention here. You can see how on any one of these topics, we could easily spend an hour just on that topic, right? And really drilling down into how to do this. So I'm gonna kind of disengage a bit from budget and just let you know, I certainly haven't covered every aspect of this, but I just want to make you familiar with the kind of components and what to be looking for, okay? And there will be that homework assignment where you can play with this and try to identify some costs, and there will be an answer key as well. And in my answer key, I gave also an Excel document that has in comments exactly which question, like where that answer was found. So as you're looking at it, you can not only see the answer on one page, but you can actually pull up this document and have it flagged exactly which cell I'm pulling that answer from, okay? There is something called invoiceable fees I do want to talk about. So if we have those milestone visits that, let's say the progress of your data and entry was what triggered payments, some of the payments are not that way. They're only paid when the study team tells the sponsor, hey, that thing we agreed to on the invoiceables, we have done something along those lines. Like we've incurred cost and we are now submitting for payment. So an example of that would be study startup, okay? Once your study is launched, there will often be part of your agreement will be a single payment that the sponsor will pay for study startup. And that is here listed on my budget. It's all the section, all the rows between 4 to 14, basically, or 13, summed up on row 14. And it's covering the IRB. The IRB has a cost, right? So the IRB is going to charge $2,000 and there's going to be an overhead component to that, 28%. So it's going to be $2,560 to the sponsor, right? And we're also going to charge for pharmacy setup. And we're also going to charge for the CTRU application. And we're going to charge for our PI and coordinators time. And we're going to charge for supplies throughout the conduct of the study, right? We're going to capture all of that at the end, all of that at the beginning, sorry. And it's going to be a total of 16,266. So as soon as that ink is, dry on the page for your agreement, we're going to be triggering a request for payment of 16,266 for this study. Each study will have a different startup cost negotiated. CRISP is a system that is the next slide here. Just touch on that. So CRISP is a web page. It's a portal in the cloud, so to speak, that is an interface between the research team and the accounts receivable team about all the work that we think that we've done and what we should be expecting in payment. There are workshops on CRISP. I would highly recommend attending one of those. I believe there are workshops. There were years ago. I assume there still are. They've been a great success, yeah. So when they'll tell you all about how to make entries within CRISP, I won't have time to go through that here today. But suffice to say, some of the things you'll put into CRISP, you're putting it in just to let the study team know, hey, this is a milestone payment. Don't go invoice the sponsor for it. They're going to pay us when the data is entered. And some of the stuff you're going to put in say, hey, this is an invoiceable item. The study sponsor isn't going to be paying us unless we tell them that. Accounts receivable team, yes, please invoice the sponsor for this. Okay. So there's a decision to make. Is this going to be triggered by the study on its own, or is this something that we need to be requesting? And the only way you're going to know that is by reading your contract. Okay. Your contract will spell out what is considered a milestone cost that the study team will issue, and when will they be issuing it? Monthly, quarterly, something along those lines. And what is something that needs to be invoiced? And what is their expectation about when they want to receive that invoice? So there's a million ways to do it under the sun, but I would just say you need to read your contract and say to know exactly what it is you're expected to execute. Okay. But yeah, the level of detail that's needed and the level of precision that's needed, I mean, it's down to the penny. They need to have the exact match to what's on your budget compared to what goes into CRISP and what the sponsor pays. You might be involved in some things like patient reimbursements. So oftentimes studies will negotiate to cover things like mileage or airfare, like car mileage, airfare, hotel costs, food costs. They do this because they want to incentivize patients to travel to Stanford to participate in the study. But there's usually a cutoff, so they can only cover for patients that live outside a certain radius. Say they live outside of 50 miles. Then for a patient that does live outside of that, they would want to cover costs for travel, just to make them whole on that extra effort they made to come to the study for enrollment. That's not a given. That has to be written into your contract, and the sponsor may not agree to that. They may not want to cover that, and that's fine. It's not like they have to cover it, but it's a way for them to have patients come from farther around the world to participate in their study. So that could be a good thing for them to cover. So when you're processing reimbursements, just to touch on things like you'll need backup. Basically, you'll need the full receipts, and then you'll need a redacted version of receipts that take out things like patient's name and identifiers, so that can be logged into our financial systems as in terms of backup. So there's full backup needed. So full backup needed is needed for our university systems, and the redacted backup is needed for the study sponsor. Okay, so just to take a quick break for a quick second, did anyone recently complete their HIPAA training? Yeah, okay. If not, okay, I'm doing your division manager or DFA solid here and reminding you to complete your HIPAA training, which is due on Sunday. Don't forget, it's very important. We will be checking to make sure everyone has done it, and you'll be getting a note if you haven't. But HIPAA, you probably remember from going through that, is data that can be accessed needs to be the minimum necessary, right? And so our study sponsors, they don't need the patient's name, they don't need the patient's address, right? It's just, they have data that's specific to the patient that is PHI, but we're redacting to the minimum necessary for the purposes of our work. So backup is going to be often redacted of things like that. So all right, you're going to have, okay, so the study startup was painful enough. When you have a contract amendment, let's say study is going along and they decide they want to do things differently, they want to add an extra visit, they want to ask for more data, all of these things the team should be thinking about, okay, what's the amendment here? Let's process a kind of all the stuff you really did pretty much for the startup, you're going to be going through all over again for an amendment. It's not going to be quite as long, but you're going to have to amend your IRB. You're going to have to amend your contract, possibly budget. If it's a substantial scientific change, you're going to have to go back to the SRC. Yeah, so just keep that in mind. There, all this stuff will kind of go all over again when you have an amendment. So I've had studies where they gave us the initial launch, like we were trying to put in the initial study, and we were 3 weeks in, and then they send us an amendment. Didn't even have the initial approved. And so it's and they're just okay, what's faster, to approve the initial version and then amend it, or should we start from scratch on your amendment? And we're trying to figure this out, and we're okay, we're going to reset and we're going to do the amendment just so that we don't have to go through this all over again. And then they're going to do it again. There's going to be another amendment that comes in. And as these startups take 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, that study might be live in different centers and they might be amending their protocol. It's crazy. So there is a real benefit to moving quickly and efficiently, getting these things in place, and not having the sponsor kind of reset your team right from the get-go and say, oh, let's pause and actually put through a different version than we gave you. Okay, and then this is really important, reconciling what's in accounts receivable and what you think you should have received, which is kind of the placeholder here is what's in CRISP. Some common issues that I noted when I was preparing is you could have a check arrive from a sponsor, and there's nothing listed in CRISP, right? So CRISP is this database that's a tracking database that says the study team has put entries in, or you and your team have put entries in that these are the payments that we expect to receive. And accounts receivable receives a check and it's for your study, and they can't match it to anything in your database. So maybe you guys have a workflow where your research coordinator is supposed to enter something in CRISP and they haven't done it, right? So maybe that's the root cause of what's going on. Maybe the sponsor had an error, right? And they wrote the wrong study on the header. And so this actually isn't for your trial. You might have an error. So this is a different kind of error where the sponsor paid you an amount and it's the wrong amount. So, their database is not sensitive to the amendments that you guys are putting in place. And maybe you've done an amendment and you've changed your pricing structure and they're still paying you on the old model, right? And so, the payment that comes in, accounts receivable is going to cash that check and they're going to put it into your account and you're going to be short based on what you're expecting if you're not reconciling. Is the amount that we received what we expected? These are not hypothetical. These are real life things that I've lived through. The CRISP entry that was made by your team might have an error. It might be a digit is transposed, or the person who was making the entries didn't understand that we have to invoice exactly what is on our contract, not what they think it should cost, or what Stanford charged us. So to say a little bit more about that piece, so Stanford Hospital will charge the study their rates for research. So if someone gets a procedure, might be like a CAT scan, a CT scan of your chest, okay? When we do our budget preparation, when we design our budget, we know what the cost of the CT scan is on that date. And generally the budget will put in place however long that study is expected to go for. Let's say it's going to be a 3-year study. We would add some inflation kind of percentage that we expect to take place over the 3 years. We would then average the cost of those 3 years, and that would be the charge that we charge the sponsor for a CT scan. Okay. So that for the whole course of the 3 years, we're not charging the sponsor what Stanford charged to study. We're charging what was agreed to in the contract. So if you have a coordinator who's not really understanding that, and they see because they're going to see the bills for the study from the hospital, and they say, oh, the hospital charged us $1,000 for the CT scan, so I'm going to put that in a CRISP. But in effect, we'd actually only negotiated being paid $900. That would be a major problem. The sponsor is going to say, why are you charging us $1,000? We'd agreed to $900, or they just won't pay it and no one will know why. Okay. And the reason is the invoice needs to match the budget, not what was paid. Some subtle ones are that the sponsor hasn't paid for milestone visits because the data is not being entered. So you might have some coordinators that, for whatever reason, are just not getting that work done. Maybe they don't have the personnel. Maybe they're trying to run 10 trials and they only have one person and it's just not enough manpower. Maybe it is the fact that your team has put in the data, but the clinical research organization that has to verify that data is slacking off. I've seen that. They come on site for 3 days. They take a lot of coordinator time, but they're really not doing their job. And so they say, oh, we'll see you in a month. Oh, we'll see you in a month. Meanwhile, they're billing their person and they're not actually doing the work to get us paid. So it could be a lot of different reasons of what's going on. And the bottom line is that no one's really going to be looking out for the fact that you guys are getting paid what you should based on your budget, except for you. You guys are going to be the heroes here, right? So it's super important to have a good command of what your budget says and to have communication with your research team about what was done, right? It's so easy to leave money on the table. You worked hard to negotiate a great budget, but if it's not being relayed to the sponsor and it's not being attended to by your team, you guys might not be getting that money. And that could make you guys have a tough time to pay your personnel, right? So, ways to go about this is to have a reconciliation tracker, right? You have some, there's different versions of this that I've used in the past where, for everything that's happened, you have a log. Basically, patient 1 had cycle 1, day 1, visit 1 on this date, and that goes into CRISP. And when it goes into CRISP, I change the color of that entry to yellow. And when it gets paid, when the payment comes in and it's reflected in CRISP, I change that to green. Or somehow, so you're tracking every single data point to make sure that you guys are getting fully paid. Is worth doing. You'll be shocked at how much money you will bring in from just holding the sponsor to the budget that was agreed to. All right, and then last we have upkeep. So just reporting timelines into the clinicaltrials.gov webpage. My understanding is that Encore is being very helpful for helping keep study teams to delivering what they're supposed to and when. So I will just say this is not something you want to be delinquent on. So when the study is finished, there's going to be a need to report certain things like how many patients were enrolled, how many patients met the time points that the study was looking for, or the outcomes they were looking for. All right, so there it is. That's the operationalize it section. The key to this going well is communication with your study team. It's super critical. It can be the case where there can be a friction between the administration and like the research administration and the clinical research group. And that doesn't really serve anyone well. we're one big team here, and the key to being able to hire more coordinators to get more work done is to get the dollars in on our trials, and that's gonna take good communication with the PI, good communication with the clinical research coordinators that they've hired. So. All right, let's blast through the end and then leave time for questions and specifics that you guys have about your work. Okay, so closing time. So when you go to close a trial, you're going to be thinking of, you're going to be getting notifications from OSR, Office of Sponsored Research, when your contract is set to conclude. So every contract will have a length of time. This is a contract is in place for 3 years, and they're going to say your contract is coming up towards the end date. Please prepare to close out your study or request a no-cost extension if that's what you need. So it could very well be the case that study is still going on. You thought it would take 3 years, but it's going to take longer. They're not sure how long, but you guys are going to put in place a no-cost extension action with the Office of Sponsored Research. But you're going to want to keep an eye out for that email. It usually comes out from their group about 2 months ahead of the closeout date on your contract. But it's on you guys to keep track of your closeout dates and make sure you're requesting extensions as needed. When you are ready to close out, they have a nice closeout checklist. This is on the Do Research page, which is for the Office of Research Administration. They keep a lot of different details in here. There's a checklist for every basic type of trial you have: federal award checklist, non-federal award, clinical trials closeout, advanced award closeout checklist. This is the clinical trials closeout checklist here. They're going to want your team to go through this, basically fill this out and submit. They're going to give details of where it goes into here. And you're going to need some details that you probably need to get from the study team. So as an example, they're going to ask actual number of subjects enrolled, how many completed, how many dropped out, how many were screen failures. You might not actually know that. You might need to talk to your study team about that. Just as an aside, what does it mean to have completed the study? It means that you've completed the plan as expected. I might have, gotten a dose of the study drug and then had a side effect and I had to come off the study. Another patient might have gone on that study for 2 years. We both completed the study, okay? Because what we did is we both followed the plan according to the plan until the plan's conclusion, whatever that would be, okay? Let's say someone dropped out. I'm leaving the state. I can't be part of your trial anymore. I'm withdrawing from the study, okay? That would be a dropout. Someone who withdraws their consent to participate, that's a dropout. Not someone who has a side effect. That would not be a dropout, okay? And a screen failure. So when someone has signed consent, they're considered to be in screening. And if their screening evaluation determined that they were not a good suitable candidate to get an experimental drug for whatever reason, generally they're screening people to make sure they're healthy enough to get something that's, at the end of the day, an experimental treatment. Maybe it requires having a healthy liver, even though you might have another disease. Let's say they just want to not have patients on that have a compromised liver, as an example, and they find out through screening that the patient's liver is compromised, they might be considered a screen fail. And so the study team will often have notes about how many screen fails they had. Anyway, so this form will need to be completed and submitted, and that will be a key piece of the closeout. You're going to want to be darn sure that you've done your reconciliation on payments. Sponsors are going to want this to be, they're not going to want at the end of a 4 or 5 year trial, oh, by the way, we went back through all 5 years and we found you guys have $500,000 of unpaid invoices. They may tell you, our contract says we need to be paid within 3 months of the date of the item, and they might push back. Often the contract will have language like that about the expectation of being invoiced in a timely way. But if you haven't done it, that certainly is the time. And even if you have done it, it's time to just confirm you've done it. So reconcile all your payments and history. Let's see. Subjects, I think that's the point about, what are the different, let's see, I think that's the next slide here. I'm kind of skipping around on my hard copies. Here's the subject. So we talked about this, who's what in terms of their status. Let's go back. Leftover funding. So if your study at the end of the day has money left over, you may be able to keep that money depending on how much it is. So this is typically the case where if your leftover funding is under 25% of the initial budget, it can be transferred into a fixed price contract account for the PI to use basically as a source of money with, frankly, not a whole lot of restrictions to it. If the remaining funds is greater than or equal to 25% of the initial budget, some of that may need to be returned to the sponsor. It depends on the sponsor, and it depends on what that negotiation is. But it's one of those things that needs to be actively discussed with accounts receivable and with your CT RMG team. And then clinicaltrials.gov closeout. So as your study ends, the PI needs to go into clinicaltrials.gov and they need to make entries to describe what were the outcomes of their study. Okay, so just a final point here is that good contracts set your team up for success. Portfolio planning can be really helpful as you think about balancing all the different contracts that you guys will have in place. Some studies pay really well. I don't know which, I'm not going to name any particular sponsors, but pharmaceutical company A might pay really well to do a study. And you might have another study that the doctor wants to do, and it's a collection of colleagues from 3 different universities, and they're going to put this together, and they don't have much of a budget, but it's really compelling science. They might have a drug company willing to donate the drug. So you'll put a contract in place for that drug to be part of the study. So they are being sponsored in a way, but it's an investigator-initiated trial, and it's not going to have much money for coordinators, right? But if you have a portfolio in your group with some sponsored trials that cover a lot and might have a little bit extra at the end of the day, and some that are a little bit tighter but really compelling science, maybe supported by a gift fund or 2, that could work. But you can see how if you're kind of out of balance, it might not work for the group. This cooperative group trial, that's another type of trial that is it's a federally sponsored trial type where the government provides the framework for investigators at institutions like Stanford and elsewhere to cooperate and put a trial together themselves. Generally not terribly well funded, but important to do. I think that's it. I think I have one more slide that doesn't want to come up. All right, so that's it. Lifespan of trial. Time for questions. And I apologize that we're in this format in terms of being on Zoom. This is done, I feel like it's so much more easy to do when we're in the same room together. But we're not. This is the best we have. I wanted to see what questions I can cover, and I'll go back and I'll look at the chat as well. I'm going to look at the questions we started. So should we use a clinical trial tracker or put everything in CRISP? So Emily, I would say you should use a tracker. It's going to have to go into CRISP. but you're really going to want your own tracker. There is an initiative to actually have CRISP be so functional that it can actually be your tracker. I think those plans are still in the works. I'm a little bit out of touch with that. Nancy, do you have any sense of has that gone anywhere with their team?
Oh, Ben, I wish that it has, but I think you're right. Since you and I actually, talked with Ben Holyomes and the team, it just hasn't kept pace with our needs, unfortunately. So it is certainly something that we need to revisit with them. I think part of it too was, as you saw in the meetings that we had, was perhaps not having full consensus among the clinical trials community as to how best to manage a clinical trial. And so unfortunately, I think, there's a little bit of pros and cons. And I think that's why, if you can spend, even if it's 10, 20 seconds, because I certainly don't want to eat into other Q&A, but to talk about, the benefits of the tracker, I think that would be helpful to the group here. You're on mute.
Sorry, my kids are like they need a snack kind of moment or something in the background. Yeah, I think it just helps you keep track of the flow of who's in the study, what has the study team done, in a way that makes sense for you. And ultimately, that's what really matters. So, and that requires good communication with your study team. You're not going to be able to do it from afar. Certainly in these days of working from home, but you need someone who's touching the work, someone who has clinical access, knows the patients involved, knows how far along they are, and they need to be working with you very closely. So, but that tracker is totally key. Yeah. Let's see, continuing with the question. So Gavin, you asked about cradle to grave process. Hopefully this covered it, would you say? Okay, good. Just a very high overview. So was there any one or two topics that you think you'd want to explore in more depth as a follow-up with the RAC team or anyone? So let me pose that one more time. Gavin, is there any particular topic that you think you'd gain more from, like a deeper dive on?
Oh, sorry, no, my connection was cutting out.
Oh yeah.
Not that I can think of right now, no.
Okay.
As I start to delve into taking over some trials and doing some work, then I might have some additional questions as I get into that.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how to set up trials correctly from the beginning, how to manage invoices. Yeah, so I mean, I think checklists are really helpful. Visiting those websites that the slides link are really key. Stanford has a ton of data, in terms of a library of what to do and process. So go check those out. Take the ORA trainings. Talk with your contacts within RMG and get to know them, and have them on a speed dial. Hopefully you guys are using Slack and you guys can message them on Slack. Get to be friends with your research support team. That will be very helpful as you're walking through this as someone who might be new to it. Questions are okay, and the folks that are more experienced will be here to coach you along. And managing invoices. So, again, yeah, accounts receivable team, as you have questions, ping them. That can be a really frustrating process, but you really have to demand their time and their, focus. I will say that when it comes to accounts receivable, you are going to help yourself tremendously to get your invoices submitted cleanly the first time, in terms of how much you're asking for, how you're describing those visits, then the opposite and having to make a correction. So, doing it right the first time, maybe it takes you 10 minutes. If you have a correction, it'll take you like 8 hours. Like, I mean, it like multiplies the complexity at that scale. Like, it's insane. You think, oh, so I said cycle 1, day 1, week 1, it should have been cycle 1, day 2, week 1. And like, once that entry goes into the system, like, good night. It's like, forget it. It's so hard to get that corrected and propagated. And then the sponsor's going to get the initial, and then they're going to get the correction. And then they're going to say, I got paid. I'm not going to pay you twice for this. And you're like, no, the correction. And just go that way. Like, you're well served to get that right as best you can. Clarita, any other thoughts about things? Or does that sound good?
That sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Top 3 most challenging issues with clinical trials. So having a good relationship between the research administration team and the clinical research team, it can be really hard. And it is, and when that relationship is a good one, it can be very fruitful. So I would say that, I mean, it's easy to get frustrated. It gets frustrating. Why aren't they enrolling patients, right? Like, we need more revenue to pay their, their labor. But ultimately we're a big team and we need to understand what are the parameters, how can we support each other and make sure we're getting good data from each other about what's gone on the trials, what we can bill for, what are the expectations, is this stuff feasible or what, it's a challenge to get things open and to have things go quickly. And we really want to endeavor to be an excellent place when, you have a doctor who maybe moved from another university, they come to Stanford, you want them to think of this place as, it's so easy for them to get trials open. They just say, hey, I have a trial. I'd like to do this. And then they have a team to support them, not to say, oh, this is really hard. Why did you even ask it? But really to take all that complexity and to make their experience amazing, right? And that's our job, to understand these processes and to be the navigator along this path, and that's hard. And that is something that's very worth doing, and you will be seen as a total gem and a resource for your team if you can be that. And also can open a lot of doors in the universities to become an expert on these different fields too. So yeah, definitely. I guess maybe I'll stop there, but that would be something I would say. We did cover about post-award for clinical trials. Hopefully that was enough. The homework assignment might seem a little daunting, but it's like just kind of the same stuff over and over in a way, with some little tricks that I threw in. And I hope you guys take a look at it. There's no better way to get this stuff than to practice. So, I'm out of questions on the chat. Anyone else have anything further? Yeah, Grace?
Yeah. I have a question about the account receivable. So I want to know, how is account receivable processing and who is responsible to update the cash in the CRISP? Because I found some clinical trial, the total cash received in the CRISP don't match with the account receivable report in BI. So I don't know who I should contact with, the RA or account receivable department.
Yeah. So which one was higher, CRISP or the accounts receivable report?
I think the total cash received on account receivable is more higher.
Yeah. So what's happening there is accounts receivable is cash and checks, but they're not going into CRISP and marking off that something was paid. Mm-hmm. And so that's an account receivable issue. Sometimes that happens. A check comes in and it's not very clear what it covered. This is a little bit in the weeds, but CRISP, it's like a database with you have an entry. Think of like at a row, and you'll say on this row, you'll say 5 different patients had a cycle. And then you'll have another entry and we'll have another 5. And the check comes in and it's going to have 2 of the entries from the second entry and it's going to have 3 of the entries from the first entry. And accounts receivable has to mark off, which partial payments came in on which check. I mean, the system's not super savvy in terms of tracking all that. They do the best they can, but they might actually not mark something off in CRISP as paid. So if you're seeing something in CRISP is not paid, and it's been a while, it's a good idea to circle back with the sponsor. And there'll be a contact in the contract to say, hey, we marked off that, XYZ visit was, covered. It's been 6 months and we were expecting something. And it may be the case that they come and say, no, we paid that and it's on this check number. And then you go to accounts receivable with that information. And you say, I learned from the study sponsor that this was paid on this check. Could you help verify? And if so, mark CRISP, so that it shows the payment. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you got it. The reconciliation process often is you will be kind of in the position of reaching out to the study sponsor, reaching out to accounts receivable, making sure that everyone is kind of on the same page. I think the workflows are just so high and so busy that things will become delinquent. Accounts receivable will say if something's in CRISP, they've invoiced the sponsor and it's not been received. It at some point they're going to go chase the sponsor down for that. You don't need to be the one chasing the sponsor down for bills. That's not what I'm saying. But when there's a question about whether a payment was received or not, you're not saying you haven't paid us. You're saying, hey, it's unclear whether the payment has come in or not. Could you help me to understand from your system, what do you show? Do you show this is paid or not paid? Yeah. So you're just kind of connecting people together. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's the approach. And when you need someone to play the bad guy and go chase down the checks, that's AR's job. So,
Thank you.
yeah. I'll say that the AR team they're very, I see a question. I'll get to it in a second here, Clarita. The AR team they're great, but sometimes depending on who your contact is, they might need a little bit of hand-holding, to ask for, follow-up on certain things. And so I would say, just being polite, but persistent on it is helpful. So, how about the holdbacks? Yes, thank you. I actually had that thought about holdbacks. How do you reconcile a holdback? So a holdback would be, the concept of a holdback is the study sponsor says, we don't want to pay you everything as you go because we want that final report. We want that final bit of data, and we don't want to lose our leverage, the study sponsor would think, right? So what they're going to do is for a portion of different types of payments, they're going to pay you 60% of it, let's say, right? So, and then they're going to hold back the remaining fraction. And that holdback will come in at the end of the study, typically is when that happens. So you would generally be looking in this portal called CRISP. And one of these days we should actually, well, I know they have a CRISP workshop on this, so I guess we'll defer to that. But we talk about CRISP in this so much that sometimes I think it'd be helpful to have like something to refer to and look at. But it'll say when the check is received, check was received, so paid, holdback. And CRISP will actually mention the holdback is in place. And so you'll know that's the case. And so your what you build and what you've received won't exactly match because of the holdback. CRISP will be a way for you to see that, and you can see what you're still owed at the study closure. And in terms of, I haven't seen any problems with study sponsors paying holdback, so long as the research team at Stanford has done everything that they're supposed to. Yeah, and it can be a big amount of payment all at the end. In terms of reconciling it, so I mean, in the contract, it should let you know exactly what fraction you should expect to be held in holdback. And so you can see what was paid and does that match what you would have expected? Good question, very good question. So my email I'm going to put in chat, and you guys are welcome to email me if you have any follow-up questions. And I want to thank you guys for being part of this training, just know this is just the introduction to so many of these things. You have tons of resources surrounding you, and just ask. And we'll, someone, if it's not, it very well may not be me, but so hopefully someone who knows what to do will be able to coach you a bit through it. So I'll pass it back to